This is not a panel discussion, everybody against Andy, although he can really defend himself. But it's about looking at the industry as a whole, in which all of us are part of. Pharma companies, service providers, regulators, clinicians, all of us operate in an ecosystem. And look at what is missing primarily, how things work today. I'll tell a bit about myself. I work for Lonza, Senior Director of Strategic Innovation. In plain English means I work around bringing new technologies to the company to facilitate development, manufacturing, and de-risk the development of pharmaceutical products. Interested primarily in new therapeutic products, bioconjugates, ATMPs, etc. And I have a background in drug discovery and structural biotechnology. I founded 2 companies before working for Lonza, looking at neurodegeneration and metabolic disease. And I also have a background in academic research, so I touch different areas, and I've seen the world in different perspectives. I would let the panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to go very quickly through some of the aspects this discussion we wanted to be about, but I want to emphasize this is not just about the panelists or myself, it's about you participating. Feel free to raise your hands, ask questions. Also, you can raise questions using the app. You can type your questions there. We will have some time at the very end where these questions will be read. But at any time, please, I would encourage you to participate, not only just asking questions, but also making points. In the end, this is a discussion for everybody to be heard. So it was interesting for me to be here yesterday because there were quite a few points, and I was saying, well, we were going to cover this and that and that. There are some objective elements in how the industry operates, and there were mentions about the IP model, or actually that the pharmaceutical industry relies primarily on exclusivity. That means that you make it, you have a blockbuster, then you are successful, and you can protect yourself from competitors. Now, the question is whether the industry is over-reliant on this model, and whether IP actually can become a real roadblocker for innovation. And I will give some examples. CRISPR is a very good one right now. It's a very successful technology technically. Is in the newspapers for the wrong reasons, actually, for litigation, not because of applications into developing new cures or new therapies. And my bet here is that it's going to be stuck in this situation for years until it gets clarified. Who is winning here? I think probably not the patients. The second one that came over and over and over again is just drugs fail often, and they fail late when they are very expensive, when the companies have invested a lot of money in the development. We were hearing Charles Bontra yesterday saying why we went until we were in phase 2A, just to realize this is not going to work. Can we do things differently? But not only that, is that even if products manage to make it all the way through clinical development, they get often stuck in registration. Payers sometimes they not supporting transitioning these products into or the funding of these products or through healthcare systems, and is well known that maybe less than 2 out of 10 or even less products that are actually licensed manage to recover the investment that was made in research. And as an average, obviously this is a bit of a gross painting. But this means that the way drugs are developed is not effective at all. It's very, very crude compared to other industries. The third one I wanted to raise was what is called imprecision medicine. And this is, I think, is just another drop in a glass of water that is going to overflow. There was a study in Nature last year looking at the top 10 the best or the most selling drugs in the US. And they found out that the study was showing that between 4 and 24% of the patients treated with these drugs actually have any benefit out of it. And I think that was quite sobering for me. This means that it is over 80% of waste. Just for Medicare, it's about $15 billion US per year. And not only that, the patients are also put at risk. So is this a good approach to how we treat patients? And again, I hope the discussion today would touch on some aspects of this. Also maybe looking at personalized medicine, what it means. Another one is the true cost of quality. And working for a manufacturing company, this is quite close to my heart. If you look at how pharma operates compared to all industries, I was talking to Andy yesterday, and I was telling you, well, pharma operates at a 3 to 4 sigma. Actually, some companies operate at 2 sigma. I know AstraZeneca is not one of them. Semiconductor industry operates 9 sigma. But the impact of this is that there's an investment, a cost to the industry, to the companies operating in the industry, between 20 and 40% of sales is invested in putting right these quality flaws. And this is the cost of recalls, this is the cost of remediations, this is the cost of impact in patients and users, etc. This is awful. I mean, you look at, no oil industry could operate under these circumstances. Semiconductor, they spend less than 1% in quality. So I think this is quite an interesting point also to have in mind. How do we assess quality, and why are we in this business, what we try to achieve? And finally, the last point I wanted to raise, and this is far too much talking for me, is the patients and clinicians and how they're engaged in the process. And there were 2 things that came up yesterday that I wanted to raise. And one was there's an issue with supply of drugs, even generics at the moment. There's a big pricing controversy, and we saw this in the last few months in the States, all sorts of different characters, some of them very colorful, operating business models that rely on pretty much boosting the price of drugs in order to making a profit, and which is fine. I mean, it's, as in any other industry, pharma industry needs to make a profit, but clearly we, as an industry, has a very bad press. We are perceived as profiteers, and we are not having at heart the interests of patients and the interests of healthcare. Can we do something about it? So that is all for me, just a starting point. And I would like now to let the panelists introduce themselves and add their contribution or their perspective to initiate the debate here. Andy, you want to start?
Yeah, thanks very much. With the title, I feel like saying I'm Andy Johnson, I'm an alcoholic, but that's a different story. So I am Andy Johnson, and I'm someone who spent their whole career in Big Pharma. So if that's like being an alcoholic, I'll own up to the admission. I've spent the vast majority of my career up to now in drug development. I was incredibly fortunate that I was involved in some really significant medicines, both early in my career and later in my career. And that had a kind of profound effect on my attitude and my view of the business. The first 2 compounds I ever worked on got all the way to market. I made the first kilogram that was ever made of Faslodex, an important breast cancer drug, and I made the first kilogram that was ever made of Arimidex with my own hands. And that has a kind of profound effect on how we look at the industry, so I have a very personal view of the industry. I think one of the key things that I think is an issue that we need to address is it kind of in this title, because it's an amusing and provocative title, find it, file it, and flog it. But what it speaks to me is the extent to which R&D in the pharma industry is compartmentalized. So many pharma industries have a discovery organization whose job it is to find a molecule to put into development. And they're incentivized by finding molecules to put into development. And then they have a development organization whose goal it is to drive the product through to registration and get approval to market that product. and then you have an organisation which sells it. And for me, that's a fundamental issue. For what I believe would be a much more effective model is that if you could begin with the end in mind, you start off with, what does the patient actually need? Now, that's a very difficult thing to translate back through, what is at the fastest 4 or 5 years and is at the slowest 20 years. But we need that overview, and we need to obviously speed up that process. But the concept of doing this in 3 chunks, I think, is always going to lead to a very difficult situation. So what we need is, we just need a pharma development model that much more reflects the way other industries develop products, which is to start with what is the unmet need, and then to work to meet in that need. So pharma is fragmented for many reasons, one of which is the scientific and technical base that it needs to do particular areas. But I think overall, one of the things that we have to do is to be much more end-to-end and much more focused on actually how will this product be used by people, and how will it be paid for, how will it be used in the healthcare ecosystem. So, really interesting debate today. I think everybody needs to look at how they do things, but everybody needs to learn. I was a bit depressed yesterday. There was a lot of doom and gloom. If you look at some of the advances that have been made in my career, which is getting a bit long now, but when I started in the industry, it was the Tagamet, Zantac. People were still going into hospital to have stomach ulcers treated surgically. Nobody does that anymore. And it's that kind of step forward that when you look back and say, yeah, this is, this has been a significant step forward in the way healthcare is provided. So there's a lot of doom and gloom, but as I said yesterday, I'm pathologically optimistic, and I think, especially with the acceleration in science now, and what we're learning around, particularly how we analyse data, how we can simulate and model, that we'll start to be able to do this a lot more effectively.
Thank you. Gary, you want to?
I'm Gary Acton. I'm a medical oncologist based in London. Part of my time I work in the Centre for Drug Development at CRUK, just up the road, and Nigel, the head of my department, is sitting uncomfortably right in front of me there. The rest of my time I provide strategic oncology drug development on a consultancy basis to a variety of smaller European and US biotech companies. Obviously, as an oncologist, my perspective is predominantly from the oncology area. If I have any claim to validity in terms of insights, I think it's that I am unique in having been directly responsible for 3 phase 3 failures in a row and the subsequent consequential implosion of a well-established UK biotech company, which I think gives me a unique insight into some of the issues and difficulties of how we currently approach the drug development process. And my thesis, if I have one, is that in the context of oncology, the time has come now for a historical revisionism and a deconstruction of the entire regulatory framework that we currently work within, so that we largely remove substantial elements of that and devolve responsibility for determining the clinical appropriateness of drugs to the patient-physician access rather than the detached, anonymous regulatory context that we currently work within. And I hope we have an opportunity to explore that a little bit later on.
Brilliant. Thank you. Graham?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Graham Cox. I work for Consortio. I'm not a management consultant, but I am a consultant, and I think it's important to distinguish the difference between the two. Management consultants, we do a lot of work trying to clear up the work that McKinsey's done on organograms, which we've already alluded to in terms of the siloed effect of pharma. What we do is we're basically very experienced pharma professionals. Andy was mentioning about the Zantac days, and I remember the Zoladex days, which was really, you know, the castration moving forward to an injection every month or 3 months. So yeah, good old days. What we've done in the last real 8 years or so is to go into companies, and from yesterday, I think you'll agree, one of the big take-homes was, you know, I think I'll quote Chas Boutra, which was Pharma are crap at 2As. And phase 2A is critically the sort of weak link in the chain, and I've never met a product director or a brand director that hasn't said in some way or form what they said in Alice in Wonderland, which was, if it was my decision, I wouldn't start from here. And that really means that they're inheriting something that is inherently wrong, and they want to try and put it right. So what we do is we go in, and because we've done this many, many, many times, there are some fundamental things that pharma don't do that other companies, I run another couple of businesses, and I've been very fortunate to work outside of pharma. And pharma, I don't know how many of you have worked outside of pharma, but nearly all companies have a very, very rigorous design process. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that pharma can take on that absolutely, but what that does do, it looks at possibilities, and it looks at opportunities and possibilities going forward. So the single TPP is one of the biggest killers of pharma, because it's some market research which is fundamentally flawed. I think we can go into that a bit later, that tells you that this is going to be the unmet need. Andy mentioned about the patient's unmet need. When you go into the reason why, or how that's collected, it's flawed. The patient unmet need that you all band around, look at the data, look at the market research, look at the technology and the terminology and the methodology of how that market research is constructed. It's all 20th century, outdated, flawed market research techniques. If you want to go into a better way of getting market research about what the real unmet needs are, the pharma needs to move into what other companies have done 10 years ago, into better techniques where you uncover real drivers of prescribing, not just putting people in a room with a coffee and a biscuit, with a great big glass wall, videoing them with a microphone saying, do you think this TPP is better than that one? It's just wrong, and all the work that Andy does and all the R&D people do, it's basically directing, in many cases, the development in totally the wrong direction. So what we do is we basically go in, have a look at all of that, debunk all the myths, take away all the rubbish that's in there that's directing things in the wrong way, and look at possibilities about what this molecule could do to avoid what Chas Boutra says, the crap 2As that are doing it. He's exposed to a lot more companies than I am, that are still going today, that are directing pharma in the wrong direction. And then you're doing phase 3, expensive phase 3s, to answer the questions that phase 2A should have done. And that is expensive and leads to the huge amount of attrition that we're still seeing in the industry. Despite all the great work that everyone's doing, it's still the same attrition rate. So some of the fundamental things we do in phase 2A are really very, very easy to put right. Well, they're easy in terms of getting the team together. I mean, how many of you spend your time really thinking about that phase of development? You know, a good day for me in pharma was getting rid of my emails and putting out the fires. And it goes day in, day out, week in, week out. I'm sure you'll do the same. Really having the time to really think very carefully, which is what outside pharma do, about the phase 2A program and opportunities. Not that we know all the answers, but looking at possibilities. That's really where you can set the whole development process in a better way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Graham.
Hi,
Rob?
good morning. My name's Rob Smith. I work for Catalent, have done now for about 4 years. I look after their product development in Europe. If I go back to the start of my career, it was in the biotech industry, where I was dealing with like milligrams of material. And then I moved to Big Pharma, where I was handling like 1,000 litres at a time, and a very different type of organisation. 10 years ago, I moved into the CDMO segment, so I hopefully can bring a bit of balance between the group in terms of our AZ colleague at the end and some of our clinicians. For me, what I'd like to try and get across is how organisations like mine are here to help, especially as we move forward. I fully get the point around the failures, and it's something I feel really strong about. We know at the minute that typically costs about $1.2 million to develop a product. It's all linked to those failures. If you look at the amount of investment we're putting in, I think it's up 2%, but the return's down. We've only seen a return of about 5%, and that's plummeted over the last few years by about 55%. So we really need to understand why these products are failing and what we can do. And the biggest challenge as we go forward is looking at the complexity of all the new types of programs coming through and how we address those.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rob. Okay, so I'd like to break the ice, asking a question to Graham, and I think you raised a point that I like very much, which is the importance of the design. But sometimes the problem with the design is that you have the wrong inputs. As you said, you are looking at the wrong specification, or you don't have specifications. Can you elaborate a bit more about that input, that market analysis? What does it mean? Particularly, I'd be interested to know your perspectives about how patients can play a critical role in driving those specifications, in defining what is the medical need, what is the role of clinicians. My feeling is that perhaps although clinicians and patients are involved, they are very late involved, primarily when things are in the clinic, and sometimes they don't have a say. They just they're there to report findings. How do you see things that should be structured in your view?
Okay, well, I think part of it is the regulators. I've never met a regulator, and I've met quite a few, not that many, probably not as many as Gary has, but that has said if you can identify a patient population that medically seems sound, with a symptomology that seems identifiable, and if you have an endpoint which is validated, I've never met a regulator that hasn't said that would be absolutely fine to go ahead with your trial. And what I think yesterday they said is that most of the restrictions in pharma are inside of big pharma. The regulators, I've been to regulatory meetings where the regulators have gone with a predetermined phase 2 or phase 3 trial. They've said, what do you think? The regulator said, that will do. And they've come back and they've interpreted that within the company as saying, this is what we must do because the regulators have said. They didn't ask the right questions, they didn't challenge, they didn't put different options together for the regulators, and therefore the regulators were perfectly within their rights to say, what you've put in front of me is fine, because it's the same as the last 2 drugs that we looked at. So I think there's that bit of it, which is the internal resistance to challenge, and that really, I think, needs to be looked at. I think the other side, which you alluded to, was the collection of what is the unmet need, the patient-centric world that we're all living in. What is the real unmet need? And really just harping back to the methodology by which you get the unmet need. If you're commercial people, you'll probably know that it's flawed. If you're technical guys, just go back and ask to see the methodology by which they collected the unmet need. It's flawed. And I was head of market research at AstraZeneca in the neuroscience area. I basically refused about 80% of the market research proposals because they were not going to answer the question which was being asked. Conjoint analyses. There's books and papers been written on how it's a waste of time and a waste of money to do these massive great conjoints that everybody throws in their bits that they want to get answered. And you put in this big black box, the computer spews out things, and then you say, well, if you had this claim changed and you put it in the computer, how much market share will you get? It's absolute tripe. And people still do it. Do you know why? Because they did it last year and they did it the year before, and people will look at them a bit oddly if they refuse to do it. So there's about 10 billion, I think, the last time I looked, dollars spent on market research. Probably 80% of it is absolute waste. Not only that, it directs the development, all that good development, in possibly the wrong directions. So I think there's some real good challenges. To pay for all of this and your fees and your coffees and everything today, if you can just take one thing away, it's just to go back and challenge that market research. And this is what, I have other companies and I have consultants into my company because I can't see my company because I'm too close to it. If you bring in consultants outside that can be objective, if marketing or clinical say, if Andy says to marketing, I don't believe the market research, it's just infighting. You would say that, wouldn't you? Getting a consultant in to look at it objectively, we have no political axe to grind. We can come in and say, right, okay, let's have a debate. And wonderful things happen when you get the discovery, development, physician, patient, marketing guys in. Wonderful things happen. You get things like saying, I never realised the receptor profile said it could do that. Goodness me, that's interesting. I never looked at the IB before. What's the IB? Marketing people. What's the investigator's brochure? It's the first detail aid the doctors ever see. And they don't even know what it is. They don't have any input to it. So how can they get something that when they launch, the IB is over here, and the doctors that were involved in the trials are saying it's this drug, and then you get the marketing team launching something over here, and the same doctors are saying, I can't believe it's the same drug. You've got to get them together earlier, and that just needs some good thinking. Phase 2, getting marketing, all the different groups together in the team. And that's where consultancy really does add a lot of value, because you can't do it yourselves. It's like lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. So I think that alone, hopefully, will pay for all this expensive stuff.
Thank you very much. I want to put that now to Andy, and because I think you raised, in my mind, is the industry pretty much prone to repeat old models of behavior and market analysis and develop a new product, looking at how to maximize profitability, which, you know, all businesses need to be profitable, obviously, rather than looking at what is the real medical need, what is the patient missing. And this, to me, also relates to some of the things that came yesterday. I think Chas mentioned this. There are multiple companies developing similar Me Too's or going for same targets. And if one fails, all of them fail, obviously. But are we approaching the development of new products in the right way? Are we just looking for the next big thing, the next thing that we can approach, rather than setting a blank canvas in front of us and really understand what needs to happen to make a difference to end users, to patients in this case, like other industries would do. You wouldn't design a car, I mean, some people do, just to here or there, but actually you really want to disrupt the market, you really want to have an impact in your market, you would go into what a car needs to have in order to appeal to a specific sector of customers. What is your view on that, Andy?
I think I sat through yesterday and sitting through a bit this morning. I kind of feel like I've missed the last 5 years of my life somewhere, because this kind of reflects very much the kind of thinking that was around 5-10 years ago, which I think was very bad and that did a lot of damage to a lot of companies, which is essentially R&D was driven by marketing. So, you know, marketing would say, if you look at the size of the lung cancer population, you know, it's a massive problem, it's a huge market. Go and look for molecules that will work in lung cancer. And companies would choose to do trials in big populations because they knew if that trial succeeded, then that would lead to a big registration and a big market. And I just think the world's moved on now. I think with the way that science has moved on now and the way that you know, we've learned from that is the mantra in a number of companies now is very much more follow the science. It's about we'll find interesting molecules that may work in lung cancer, but we will try to screen them and find out where they really do work, and where they really do work, we'll go after that hard. So if you look at some of the compounds we're developing now, they're not for specific mutations, they're for the mutation that follows on the first mutation. And when you identify such a small target that, you can go really fast, have a really big impact. So I think it's a switch between follow the science and follow the market. And it's a bit of an act of faith that says you follow the science, and if you understand the science fast enough and you work well enough and you work with the right people, you'll find a path to market that will work. I think there's another area that I'm really interested in as well, which is, I think it picks up on Gary's point about regulatory. There's two things about regulatory. One is we're in this mindset continually of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And really what we just need to do is figure out the development path that gets this molecule to a patient. That's one aspect. And then I think there's another aspect which we're just starting to explore because we're working with companies like Patients Like Me, people who have you know, a better view of what of how drugs are used in the healthcare ecosystem. But one of the things that we're really interested in is in the concept of symptoms that matter. So if you look at the registration pathway for rheumatoid arthritis drugs, what you have to meet is a score. You have to get registration, you have to change a rheumatoid arthritis score, which, to be honest, is pretty meaningless to anybody other than a regulator. If you talk to a rheumatoid arthritis patient and you ask them what they want to do, they actually say, what I want to do is I want to be able to walk around the park and play football with my grandkids, and I want to be able to do my gardening.
Mobility.
Yeah? So regulatory pathways to market say what you actually have to do is make a statistically significant improvement of this score, which in its description, I looked it up yesterday, says this data is fed into a complex algorithm. Yeah? Now, that's not a symptom that matters. And so we're really interested in the concept of what are symptoms that matter to patients. And even if you look at oncology, you pick progression-free survival or overall survival. What really matters to patients? We thought that we'd launched some great drugs in the 80s. And when you talk to patients, they're like, this drug gives me such a bad problem with diarrhea that if I'm traveling between London and Birmingham, which he did every weekend to meet his girlfriend, he had to stop at every service station. And he knew every service station between London and Birmingham. And we thought we developed a great drug and it was rubbish. And okay, that's a side effect that matters. But what are the symptoms that matter to patients? How do you get to those patients as quickly and effectively as you can? So for me, that's the kind of perspective. One is follow the science, not the market. And then the other one is, what are the symptoms that matter and how can you start to develop products that address those?
But Andy, you mentioned there about you have to do this for regulatory. You don't. You don't have to follow it. You know it's wrong, and therefore you can go and work out a better symptom endpoint that you can put in. You only do it because it's the easiest thing to do, because regulatory have already signed off on it. So you don't have to. It's just that the problem is self-perpetuating because you do.
Well, if you look at how you get a molecule registered for rheumatoid arthritis now, that's the pathway. You can try to change the pathway.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah,
And
exactly. And I've never met a regulator that hasn't said, come to me with some fresh ideas. But they don't.
who don't?
The pharma companies don't. They just say, that's what we've got to do, so we'll do it.
Well, there's a choice, isn't there? Either you spend the time having the argument, or you say, actually, what you should do is focus on the patients, on the symptoms that matter. And if you change the symptoms that matter, what you would believe is that the score would change as well.
And if your primary endpoint is a different one, you're stuck in the water with a claim and a detail aid that doesn't say anything useful.
And I think that's a
It's
question
insane.
I wanted to put to Gary, and I think you both raised very important points, which is what are the clinical endpoints we're using, particularly in oncology, that people seem to be satisfied with extending the life of patient, the survival of patient for a few months. And then maybe that's not what patients are looking for. And my question is, are we just looking at marginal improvements in new drugs versus old? Or are we looking for really new approaches, new therapeutic approaches that make a real difference to patients' lives? And I know there are some products there that have a lot of promise in oncology, but I'd like to have your view, Gary. What do you think is missing there? Particularly, you mentioned the engagement of patients early on, the better engagement of clinicians early on. How do you envisage things in the future?
Is that me?
Yeah.
I think the original question was, how do we identify drugs that meet needs? And obviously we need drugs that work better, but inherent in that is the question, what defines work and how does one quantitate better? And in the context of oncology, for example, there is no universally accepted way of defining efficacy. Are you looking for a drug that will cure a patient, which unfortunately few do? Is that your definition of it works? Or are you looking for a drug that will prolong survival for a limited, finite period of time, be that 6 months, a year, or whatever? Or, as Andy was alluding to, are you looking for something that will just make a patient feel better? And differing patients, physicians, regulators, all of us, I think, have differing perspectives on that. And inherent in that as well is the issue that most drugs, certainly in oncology, have a degree of activity, although usually it's limited, and a significant liability for toxicity. And so there's a need to formulate a balance of, is the efficacy, such as it is, worth the toxicity that comes with it? And I believe that's a very unique determination to each patient and their physician. There are some patients who will take any risk, incur any degree of side effects to prolong their life for however short a period of time it might be. And conversely, there are others who think, I'm just going to go on a cruise for the 3 or 4 months I have left and enjoy what I have. And this, I think, is the problem in assessing, do oncology drugs work, that there are so many differing dimensions to it, and it ultimately devolves down to this efficacy toxicity balance, that it's no longer appropriate, in my opinion at least, for that to be left to regulators to make a public health determination of whether a drug should be approved on the basis that the efficacy is justified in the context of whatever toxicity there may be. But that needs to be devolved down to a private health determination of individual physician-patient relationships. And that's going to become more relevant as we see a progression in the management of cancer towards increasingly many conditions, while still not being curable, being transformed into chronic conditions that will be managed with very many sequential therapies over probably many years of the patient's remaining life, which emphasizes and magnifies the necessity for the patient-physician determination to be predominant, rather than it being left at the macro level of the regulator. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. The problem in that, obviously, is if you were to remove the regulatory process in terms of determining the approvability or otherwise of a drug, which I actually think in an ideal world we should be doing, how do you then construct a commercial funding, pricing environment around that? But if one puts that to one side for a moment, then in my opinion, the role of the regulator should be to ensure that when a drug is coming to the market for the first time, or becoming available outside of clinical trials for the first time, that sufficient data has been generated in clinical trials to allow a physician or an informed patient to make that risk-benefit determination. But that's where the role of the regulator should really cease. It should not be to make that determination for the patients. It should be to ensure that the data's there for them. And that's more important in the context of the current environment of immediate accessibility and transparency of information that we now have. So if you go back to the origins of the regulatory system, back with thalidomide in the early 60s, there was no internet, obviously. There was no process to rapidly disseminate data as it emerged from clinical use of a drug. And so the early findings of congenital abnormalities with thalidomide were documented in obscure obstetric journals in Australia, but they never found their way for many years to the US and other parts of the world, including Europe, whereas now the rapidity and the immediacy and the transparency of the availability of information removes that role of the regulator in many ways, I think, to ensure that there's adequate demonstration of safety and efficacy. So I think that we live in oncology, at least, in a very rapidly changing environment, and it's impossible to implement this macro regulatory framework that we've worked under before, and we owe it to patients, physicians, and pharmaceutical companies to find a more flexible way of recognizing the individuality of many treatment choices that are going to emerge, and the interpretation whether they are suitable or not for a particular patient in a given clinical context.
Graham, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think oncology, has made, probably most people would agree that oncology's made sort of maybe the best strides in pharma as the sort of jewel in the crown that's keeping the industry really buoyant. But I think you remember when the train and the coach industry were looking at each other in terms of pricing and looking at each other as main competitors, and neither of them looked at the aeroplanes that took the business from both of them. And I think in the oncology, the prescription market, I think you need to look outside of that to see where the real threat's coming from oncology.
Yeah. I like one of the things you mentioned, Gary, which in a way to me brings a new perspective to personalized care, which is looking at the voice of the customer, the patient, and patients with the same condition, even the same symptoms, same disease stage, might decide take different treatments because they suit their lifestyles. You might have a perspective that I like to be alive for as long as I can because I want to spend time with my family, etc. Or you might decide I want to minimize my symptoms so I can enjoy 4 months of my life, and live to the limit. And this is a bit extreme and a bit unfair of what patients go through. But I think to me reflects that although there is a lot of interest in the research stages to really address the mechanisms of disease, maybe the industry is not good enough at listening to what the patients go through or what the patients want to do, and in a way it's empowering patients and clinicians to make the right decisions to their individual choices rather than coming from a more hierarchical approach, regulatory, and just say, well, this is the way we have to do it.
Well, I think if you look at... Sorry. Okay.
No, you.
I think if you look at the way that the data is collected, I think Andy's quite right to say or dismiss what marketing say as being the patient needs or have his own views. I think you're quite right to challenge it. I think that the conduit by which the patient needs come through to the development side is usually through the marketing functions. And as I said before, it's flawed. So I think that by moving forward to a more of a behavioural economics model, I mean, if you'll just write down Philip Graves and Consumerology, it's a great book, it's a great fun book, and read that, you'll realise really simply how the market research that the drugs industry do is flawed. So, don't say that we know about the customer needs, because I don't think that they do. If they do it properly, like non-pharma companies have been doing for many years, I think they'll get a greater insight into endpoints and unmet needs that really need uncovering, and then you can go back and have a good discussion with the regulators. But I think the way that it's captured at the moment is really dubious.
Andy?
Can I?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to add something to that. I recently was out in the US and I managed to go and see a customer, and they were set up such that they did RX products and OTC products. And they'd realised on the OTC products, they really need to understand the customer, the patient. So they built a nice house, they've got video cameras in there, they invited people to come in, stay over. They saw how they interacted with the products that they were selling. Yeah, they had a social meeting area where they'd sit down with them and have forums and understand more about the drugs and their impacting, how affordable they were, how easy they were to use. Yet you ask the question of them, why are you not using this on the RX? And it goes back to, well, because the regulators aren't interested in that. Now, I do know the FDA, not necessarily I'm defending the regulators, the FDA are encouraging those types of debates at the minute. We just need more of that.
Thank you.
I think I find they always have. I think regulators are fine. They're an open door. I just think pharma are scared. They don't go to them and actually challenge them. They love challenge, but...
It's easy not to challenge, isn't it?
It's easy not to challenge, yeah. Keep doing what you've done. Get an old protocol off the shelf from 5 years ago, stick it in front of them. Is that going to work? Of course it will. Off you go. I mean, that's really what this comes down to, and I think it's summed up beautifully by yesterday's conclusions around, just the thinking that goes into the 2A's and setting the course on the right way. And I spend my life going around companies looking at these, and it's really all the answers are in the room. All the answers are with the experts working in the pharmaceutical company. I haven't got the answers, but what I can do is create the environment where those experts can challenge each other And most of them say, I've never done this before. In my whole career, I've never sat down and had this discussion about this product, what it's going to do with all of these different experts.
Sorry,
And it's really interesting.
I just realized we taken a lot of time. I apologize. I'd like to open the floor for questions. And there's a few. And if you could put any questions that have come through the app up there, please. You want to?
Hi there, thanks. Thanks for that. I'm Richard Weaver. I'm the founder of Xenergesis, which is a preclinical CRO company in drug metabolism. Great debate this morning. I've been here for a day and a half and nobody's talked about drug exposure yet. And yet the reason drugs don't work is they don't have enough exposure or the correct exposure. And the reason they're toxic is because they have too much exposure. And getting that right is absolutely critical. And they're the reasons why drugs fail. And this can be done, okay? So we choose a dose. We don't normalise it to the patient. We don't normalise it to their background. We could easily do this. It would be very expensive, but I'm quite passionate about this and getting this right. It's all about the correct drug exposure. Paracelsus said it 500 years ago, and he's absolutely right now. So can we have some comments on the panel about drug exposure, please?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I'm much as I love to argue with Graham, I don't mind agreeing with him either. One of the things that I think is a real issue here is the way that the design criteria or the URS for drugs and the extent to which that it's driven by a kind of nebulous target product profile. And most of my background has been in the pharmaceutical sciences area, and actually, what you get a lot of what we want is a once-a-day tablet, because that's what marketing think that the market needs. And what we tried to do is actually, I'll go back to this a lot because it's kind of the new mantra, which is to follow the science, which is to actually then go back and say, talk to the biologist and say, what do you want this drug to do at the receptor? What kind of exposure do you want at the receptor? And what will be the biological impact of that? And if you can achieve that, if you set that as your primary goal, rather than we're going to develop a once-a-day tablet, and try to squeeze the biology to fit a once-a-day tablet, and you go back to actually the most efficacious product and the safest product you're going to get is if you get this selectivity at this receptor for this amount of time, and you design your product to meet the science rather than what somebody in marketing tells you they need, which will always be a once-a-day tablet. that will be the that will solve the exposure problem. But I think it's what you're aiming at.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. But I think that's where we're going, because we recognise that that having the right target is the first step. The next step is doing the right kind of biology and chemistry to get that kind of exposure, and that's where you have to collaborate with people like yourselves. But there's a lot of expertise generally as well. But that I think is a fundamental point: is you have the conversation with the right people around what does the science tell you that you need to do with this molecule? Where does it need to be? Where do you not want it to be? So there's a huge amount of research on drug targeting and, making sure that we get to the right organs and we don't get into the wrong organs. I think that's the debate that's happening now. But I think the issues that we've had in the past have been, what we should develop here is a once-a-day tablet. And then you end up with too much exposure in the first few hours and not enough at the end, because that's your design criteria. You have to follow the science and the biology and what you really want.
There was a question here, and then Graham, maybe you want to answer after that. Sorry, I want to have some more questions from the audience here. Please.
Yeah, Martin Ash from NSF Health Sciences. I've been in the industry for 35 years, worked with Andy at AZ for many, many years. And, when I listened to the debate yesterday, I listened to the debate today, there's no question that we as an industry have done incredibly well. But when you listen to the attrition rates, the statistics, it's really difficult to argue anything about what Graham is saying. So why are we so reluctant? Because what fascinates me is the thinking at senior levels in the industry that drives the decision making. Are we following the science or chasing the dollar? Because actually the elephant in the room, because I'm an operations person, okay, so I'm not into research and development. I spent my entire career making product. I help companies make product. when I work with companies, the commercial pressures manufacturing is under are immense. I don't hear about the patient, I hear about get it out the gate. They don't even have time to do proper root cause investigations. QPs releasing product are performance managed against releasing product. So the question to the panel is it short-termism that is preventing us from sitting around a table saying, we've got to fix this, because it isn't working. The attrition rates prove that. High levels of reject rates in manufacturing prove that. That's remained the same for decades. So it isn't working. What's stopping us? Is it because actually the city is more important to influence than the patient? Mm-hmm. Is it the profit and loss account and the quarterly results are more important than following the science?
Thank you very much. Maybe you want to answer?
I think
and
I can combine
at the back after.
I think I can combine these two actually, because I think what the gentleman there said about if we just step back from exposure to a drug before you even think about what receptor, how much of it you need to get to the receptor, you must understand what the indication is. Because, you know, if you've got an asymptomatic versus a symptomatic disease, the amount you need to get to the receptor is critical. So before you even start thinking about once a day and dosing and exposure, you need to really think about the opportunities that that drug might give you in terms of a wealth of different indications. And then, once you've got the indications you're going for, then you can start trying to work out how you're going to get the maximum amount of drug to that receptor. And there's a lot of great technology that helps you sort of do that and drop it where it's supposed to be. But I think that this just going forward with maybe with a set indication as written in stone, I think that's the thing that needs to peel up back and actually ask those questions. I think to your point, I think it's a mindset in terms of the, I had board members coming round to me looking at the sales for the last week and the last month. Mm. Now that is running a company looking in the rear view mirror. Mm. And, that is, I don't think it's an inevitability of how to run a company. I think it's just a lack of confidence. And if you look at the amount of market research and the amount of looking in the rear mirror and the amount of justification, it's inversely proportionate to how confident you are. Apple don't do market research. They don't spend anything like what pharma do. The more lacking in confidence they are, the more you throw money at doing market research to take each small step. It's just the wrong way about it. Pharmaceuticals used to create corridors, create departments in hospitals. That's what we did. We've forgotten that, and now we're trying to retrofit everything into the corridors that be. There's no reason why we can't get new corridors with new indications and whole new ways of agreeing symptomatology and symptom clusters. We just seem to have lost our way.
Thank you very much. There's 2 questions more. We have 5 minutes. There's a lady here with a microphone and a gentleman down there.
Good morning. My name is Pilar Pinilla. I work for NICE, for the Department of Scientific Advice. So I'm actually delighted to hear the panel today mentioning the importance of design, early engagement, and the importance of hearing the patient voice. Because basically, at the end of the day, what we want and health technology assessment bodies wants to see is improvement, final improvement to patients. And we want those outcomes being collected. So I'm delighted to see that the panel is considering that's the way to go. However, the panel has talked about the regulators. The panel have talked about the importance of pharma, but the panel haven't mentioned the payer at all. Uh-huh. So, and we are there offering the opportunity to pharma to have an early engagement and to hear what the patients wants to see being collected in a clinical trial. That is what the payers wants to see being collected in a clinical trial. I think that you, Graham, really pointed out a good point saying, well, basically, the regulators are open to see other endpoints as long as you provide them and you ask the right questions. So, and I completely agree with you. I think that asking the right question is the key. And providing scientific advice parallel with the regulators and the HTA bodies, if you hear the conversation at the end of the day, you can see how the regulators and HTA body actually agree on many things, and regulators are open and actually consider, well, basically, yeah, that endpoint that you are pointed out makes more sense. So my point is more just a comment, basically. Why you think that companies are more reticent to hear the payer's voice, to seek early engagement with payers, which actually involve patient experts during the scientific advice meetings?
Just a second, because we have a little time. I'd like to get another question, and then the panel might will have the opportunity to answer.
Thank you. Tony from Consortio. I think that one of the key issues is not necessarily asking stakeholders the right questions, it's asking them directly those questions. Because in most cases, people, one, don't know what they want, and often they can't access it, they can't articulate it because it resides within their non-conscious. So going and asking a patient what they want often leads to the wrong product being developed and consequently failing as it's commercialized. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you very much.
I think to the first point, I mean, the reason why NICE have a great problem is because if you look back, and I might be wrong in terms of what's in phase 3 now, but half of phase 3s do trials that are showing non-inferiority against the market leader, which is going to be generic by the time they launch. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very difficult position for NICE to be in, because I wouldn't approve it, because they're asking for a lot more money for it, for something that's already there. So I think it goes back to this whole thing. The payer view, the payers will pay for something if there's something worth paying for. It's really simple. And pharmaceutical companies tend to do trials which are the same trials they did before, because the regulators say they must do them, which I think is wrong, and they come up with the same endpoints, and they do non-inferiority because they're scared that their drug hasn't properly done in phase 2A what it should have done, which is show it's good. And therefore, in phase 3, they're doomed to failure, and poor NICE are there sitting there saying, well, we can't approve this, or we don't think it's value for money, because you're asking for a lot more money for something that's the same as something out there that's generic. It's really simple stuff. The payers are NICE, and all those bodies would be delighted to see a drug that had not just better, but a different patient selection, a different endpoint, something that patients actually valued. They would be delighted with it. But where is it?
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. We have 30 seconds to go. So I think that sums it up really for today. I want to thank the audience and the panelists for their generosity to be here and to be engaged in this dialogue. And I hope this discussion was of value to you all. And I look forward to have further discussions during the breaks. Thank you very much, everybody.